They erased her name overnight like it had never existed. A single stroke of a pen by the HOA, rewriting the rules of her own property as if she didn't belong. Threats followed, letters piled up, each more aggressive than the last, warning of fines, towing, and legal action she supposedly couldn't fight. And yet, she didn't panic. She never did. Because behind the calm smile, behind the elegance that fooled everyone in the neighborhood, sat a power nobody dared imagine. A billionaire husband quietly controlling every tow truck in the county. The very hands they used to scare her, to intimidate her, were now under his command. Every violation, every threat, every petty HOA rule. They were about to collide with a force they hadn't accounted for. But how far would she go to defend her home, her name, and her dignity? And could the HOA's so-called authority survive the storm that was about to descend on them? The answer would shock everyone on her street and change the neighborhood forever. Before the storm, life on Willow Creek Lane seemed ordinary to anyone driving past. The manicured lawns, the sparkling driveways, the pastel-painted houses, all arranged in perfect, almost sterile order, like a postcard that never changed with the seasons. Yet, for Mariah Thompson, the neighborhood had always felt more than just a street of neatly trimmed hedges. It was her sanctuary, the place she chose to raise her children, the place where late afternoons smelled of freshly cut grass and the faint hum of sprinklers, where laughter spilled from backyard patios and Sunday barbecues turned neighbors into friends. She had moved here years ago, drawn by the sense of security the homeowners association promised. The idea that rules could protect rather than confine. Maria's life had always been one of balance. A successful entrepreneur in her own right, she had built a career that demanded precision, intelligence, and unshakable confidence. Her husband Marcus was quietly formidable, a billionaire whose presence was felt more in influence than in flaunted wealth. While many imagined ostentation, his true power lay in subtlety, in control, in knowing the gears behind the scenes that no one else ever noticed. Together, they had carved out a life that blended elegance, privacy, and an unspoken authority that neighbors respected without fully understanding. Her mornings were filled with ritual. Coffee on the balcony overlooking the street, the soft chatter of birds weaving through the oaks, and the occasional jog past children riding bikes or couples walking dogs. She knew her neighbors' routines almost instinctively, waving to Mr. Henderson trimming his roses, nodding to Mrs. Liu walking her twin poodles, exchanging brief smiles with the couple renovating the house at the corner. It was a neighborhood built on appearances, where every hedge was symmetrical, every mailbox aligned, and every complaint recorded and logged by the HOA with uncanny diligence. Maria had always admired the order, the predictability. The sense of shared standards seemed to keep chaos at bay, until that order revealed its darker side. The HOA board meetings were initially nothing more than background noise. Slightly tedious gatherings where minor grievances were aired, paint colors were debated, and rules were reinforced with gentle reminders. Mariah had attended a few, more out of courtesy than necessity, nodding politely as disputes over lawn decorations, bird feeders, and mailbox flags unfolded. It never occurred to her that those meetings were a testing ground, a quiet way for control to be asserted, a place where petty frustrations could be amplified into power plays. Her neighbors were friendly, in the way that people are when civility is expected but not always genuine. Complaints were whispered behind closed doors, a tree overhanging a driveway, a mailbox slightly askew, a holiday light strung too early. Mariah had learned quickly to smile, to nod, to complain when needed, yet never compromise her integrity. Her home was more than bricks and mortar. It was a symbol of everything she had worked for, and she wasn't about to let subtle intimidation unsettle that foundation. But even in paradise, tension could creep in like a shadow. One afternoon, while Mariah was trimming her rose bushes, she noticed Karen, a newer resident, standing across the street with a clipboard, a frown etched deep on her face. Karen had the sort of presence that made people uncomfortable without ever raising her voice. A sharp gaze, a polished haircut, and a habit of noting every minor imperfection as if preparing evidence for a trial. Mariah offered a polite wave, which Karen barely acknowledged, returning to scribbling in her notebook. Something about the intensity of her scrutiny lingered in the air, like the calm before a storm no one wanted to name. It started small. Notes slipped under doors. Friendly reminders that a lawn had grown too long. Observations that a trash bin was left out for an extra hour. At first, Mariah smiled and corrected whatever was mentioned, chalking it up to neighborhood standards. But the frequency increased and the tone shifted. There were letters now, formal, signed by Karen on behalf of the HOA, each more insistent than the last, warning of fines and compliance deadlines. Mariah sensed a change in the neighborhood's rhythm. What had once been warmth and order was now punctuated by calculated pressure. Neighbors she once considered casual friends began to behave differently too. Compliments faded into wary glances, conversations became clipped and polite rather than genuine. The perfect lawns and tidy fences took on a different meaning. They became markers of compliance, symbols of who belonged and who was subtly being questioned. Mariah tried to maintain perspective, reminding herself that rules existed for a reason, that the HOA was meant to ensure harmony. But instinctively, she felt the first prickling of unease, a warning that the rules were being wielded not for fairness, but for control. Even Marcus noticed the shift. Though he rarely interfered in neighborhood matters, he had a keen eye for the dynamics that often went unnoticed. One evening, he walked the property line with Mariah, surveying the street from the top of the driveway. "There's a lot of tension under the surface," he remarked casually, eyes scanning the rows of homes. "That Karen doesn't just enforce rules, she tests people. She wants to see who blinks first." Mariah nodded, feeling a chill despite the warm sun dipping behind the oaks. It was subtle, but the warning was clear. What started as minor disputes could escalate quickly, and the HOA's power was far from impartial. Still, life moved forward. The children played in the yard, their laughter a counterpoint to the undercurrents of unease. Maria tended to her garden, Marcus managed his work quietly, and the neighborhood continued its rhythm, seemingly unchanged on the surface. But beneath the facades of order and civility, something was brewing, an invisible tension that stretched from the HOA boardroom to the carefully trimmed lawns, from the polite waves of neighbors to the sharp eyes of Karen taking notes. Every letter, every threat, every passive-aggressive remark was a thread in a web that would soon tighten around Mariah's home, her family, and her peace of mind. And then the first real violation appeared. A notice posted in bold letters on her driveway declaring that her name had been erased from the HOA records. A bureaucratic move that stripped her of legitimacy in her own neighborhood. It wasn't just paperwork, it was a statement. A declaration that authority lay with Karen and the board, and that compliance was no longer optional. Mariah felt a surge of disbelief, followed by a simmering determination. She had faced challenges before, and she would face this one too. But as she read the threats stacked neatly beneath the notice, each promising fines, towing, and legal entanglement, she understood something crucial: the neighborhood she loved was about to become a battlefield, and the rules were about to be weaponized in ways nobody could have predicted. It was in that moment, standing on the driveway with the fading sun casting long shadows across the lawn, that Mariah realized the fight ahead would require more than patience. It would require strategy, courage, and leverage the HOA could never imagine. And while Karen thought she held all the cards, she had no idea that the quiet power behind Mariah, the billionaire husband who controlled more than just wealth, was already in motion. A simple threat of towing, a petty violation letter, a bureaucratic erasure of a name. None of it would matter when the balance of power shifted in ways the HOA could never foresee. The stage was set. The neighborhood's polished surfaces hid the tension. The letters and warnings were only the beginning, and Mariah stood at the center of a storm she didn't ask for. But one she was more than ready to face. Every neighbor, every board member, every petty rule would be tested against someone who refused to yield, someone who understood the game better than they could imagine. And the question lingered, heavy in the humid evening air. How far would she go to reclaim her name, her home, and her dignity? Because in Willow Creek Lane, appearances were everything. But power, when wielded quietly and decisively, could change everything in an instant. Life on Willow Creek Lane had never felt quite so suffocating. Every morning, Mariah stepped out onto her driveway, expecting the calm neighborhood rhythm she loved, only to find another HOA notice pinned to her gate, another violation letter tucked under the mat, another demand that seemed designed not to correct, but to intimidate. Each one was more absurd than the last. A complaint about the color of her garden lights, a citation for edging that wasn't precisely in alignment with HOA specifications, an accusation that her children's basketball hoop violated a 15-year-old guideline nobody had ever enforced before. At first, she tried to comply, making subtle adjustments, double-checking measurements, and writing polite replies. But the HOA wasn't seeking compliance. They were testing her, probing for cracks, eager to see frustration take root. The first major confrontation came one Tuesday morning. Maria had just returned from her run when she noticed Karen standing by the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, inspecting her rose bushes with an intensity that felt almost predatory. "Good morning," Maria said, offering a polite smile, but Karen didn't respond. Instead, she tapped her pen against a sheet of paper and motioned vaguely toward the yard. Maria followed her gaze and froze. A small, inconsequential solar light by the garden path had apparently been installed without prior approval. It was a trivial infraction in any other neighborhood, but here it became evidence of negligence, proof of disrespect toward HOA authority. Later that day, another notice arrived, an official warning that if Maria did not remove the light within 24 hours, she would face a $500 fine. Her initial calm began to fray. She had always believed in rules, in fairness, in the idea that guidelines existed to protect, not to torment. But the HOA's approach was relentless, impersonal, and calculated. She began documenting every letter, every visit, every minor complaint, realizing that Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was an architect of psychological pressure, a master of petty enforcement who thrived on the illusion of power. As the days passed, the intensity increased. Trash cans were photographed by HOA representatives, supposedly out of compliance, and sent in emails with timestamps and stern warnings. A new rule about landscaping curves appeared overnight, citing some obscure clause buried deep in the HOA charter. Maria tried reasoning, explaining that her lawn was maintained according to common standards, but her emails went unanswered, or were met with curt replies demanding immediate correction. Frustration mounted not only in her mind, but in her body. Every morning felt like stepping into a gauntlet, every glance from Karen or another board member a reminder that neutrality no longer existed in Willow Creek Lane. Neighbors began to notice the tension as well. Friendly waves became guarded smiles, conversations shortened, and subtle glances carried judgment. Maria could feel the unspoken question in the air today: would she give in, or would she push back? And while some residents offered sympathy, few dared intervene. Karen's reputation as the enforcer, the woman who could summon fines, tow trucks, and legal threats at will, cast a shadow over the street. Then came the first direct act of sabotage. One morning, Maria discovered her mailbox had been bent nearly in half, the lock broken, and a threatening note stuffed inside. Compliance is mandatory. Next time, consequences will escalate. It wasn't just a violation notice. It was a warning, a psychological maneuver to make her doubt her own place in the community. She felt a surge of anger, tempered by the need for caution. Any rash move could give the HOA the pretext it sought. But she also realized that subtle retaliation might be necessary. Passive compliance was no longer enough to protect her family and her property. The harassment escalated further when Karen organized an official HOA inspection, a spectacle that seemed designed to humiliate. A team of representatives arrived unannounced, walking the property with clipboards, measuring tapes, and cameras, documenting every imperfection. No matter how minor, they lingered on the driveway cracks, the placement of potted plants, even the angle of outdoor furniture. Maria watched from the window, fury coiling like a spring inside her chest. It was clear this wasn't about rules. It was about control, domination, and intimidation. And for the first time, she felt the weight of helplessness that comes from knowing the system is rigged against you. Despite the mounting pressure, Maria refused to show weakness. She meticulously documented every encounter, took photographs, and kept a journal of each communication, anticipating that someday, evidence would be necessary. And while she planned her response, The stress began seeping into her daily life. She double-checked every letter, reviewed every HOA clause, and watched the neighborhood interactions with a new, wary eye. Marcus, ever observant, noted her growing frustration and began quietly strategizing. He didn't speak openly about power or influence, but his presence reminded Maria that she was not alone, that the threats she faced were powerless against someone who controlled not just wealth, but leverage. Meanwhile, Karen's behavior became increasingly brazen. One afternoon, she was caught trying to adjust the boundary markers on Mariah's property, claiming the fence line was improperly aligned. Mariah confronted her calmly, recording the interaction on her phone. Karen's face hardened, a flash of irritation passing through her controlled demeanor, but she continued insisting on compliance, as if authority alone could bend reality. The confrontation ended without resolution, but the tension escalated, leaving both women aware that their conflict had moved beyond petty disputes into a full-blown battle of wills. The psychological warfare didn't stop there. Notices appeared on Mariah's car warning of towing, letters threatened fines for obscure infractions, and Karen began calling neighborhood meetings under the guise of community concerns, where Mariah found herself subtly criticized in front of other residents. Every small victory, removing the solar light, fixing a mailbox, adjusting the fence, was met with a new challenge, a new violation, a new test. The HOA had learned how to push her patients to the edge without ever breaking legal boundaries, and Mariah understood that their goal wasn't resolution, but exhaustion. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Mariah refused to yield. Each act of harassment fueled her determination, sharpening her focus. She began analyzing HOA documents, memorizing clauses, identifying procedural weaknesses, and mapping every neighbor interaction. She recognized patterns: how Karen manipulated the board, how letters were timed to maximize stress, how small infractions were amplified for effect. And quietly, methodically, she began to prepare. She would not respond with anger or haste, but with precision. The first breakthrough came when a neighbor, initially hesitant to intervene, revealed evidence that Karen had misrepresented certain rules to justify her harassment. The documents were subtle, requiring careful scrutiny, but they confirmed Mariah's suspicion Karen was bending rules to intimidate, creating a narrative of noncompliance where none existed. It was a small victory, but it reinvigorated Mariah's confidence. She realized that the fight was not just personal, it was about exposing abuse of power, about reclaiming fairness in a system designed to favor the boldest, not the rightest. As the tension escalated, the community itself became a stage. Mariah found herself under constant scrutiny, every action judged, every expression analyzed. She was trailed by inspectors for trivial reasons, confronted by neighbors acting on Karen's suggestions, and inundated with letters demanding explanations for actions that violated no real rules. And still, she endured, refusing to be cornered. Her anger transformed into resolve, her frustration into strategy, her fear into clarity. Then came the turning point, a particularly audacious attempt to tow her car, citing a fabricated violation. The notice was delivered in bold red letters, threatening immediate removal and heavy fines. Mariah's pulse quickened, not with panic, but with recognition. The HOA had miscalculated. Marcus, ever patient, had already coordinated with the tow companies in the county, creating a situation where any attempt to enforce such threats would meet instant resistance. Mariah didn't need to act yet. The leverage was in place, quietly waiting. But the HOA's overreach revealed the first real crack in Karen's armor, and Mariah knew it. Every interaction, every threat, every petty rule had built to this moment. The neighborhood that had seemed idyllic, orderly, and peaceful was now a theater of conflict, where psychological tactics, bureaucratic manipulation, and subtle intimidation collided with quiet power, patience, and strategic planning. Mariah had endured weeks of harassment, fines, and public scrutiny, yet she remained poised, resolute, and observant, knowing that the HOA's aggression had set the stage for a decisive confrontation. By the time the next HOA meeting arrived, Mariah was prepared. She had gathered documentation, identified procedural violations, mapped Karen's manipulations, and coordinated with Marcus to ensure that any attempt at intimidation would meet immediate counteraction. The stakes were higher than ever. fines, public humiliation, and the threat of legal escalation loomed over her. But she understood now that each act of harassment had been a misstep, an overextension of authority that would ultimately work in her favor. And yet, the tension was palpable. Karen entered the meeting room with the confidence of someone who believed in absolute control, unaware that her every move was anticipated, her every bluff exposed, her every threat vulnerable. The rising action had reached its peak, the neighborhood the HOA, and every resident was now caught in a web spun by Karen's overreach and Mariah's quiet, meticulous preparation. One misstep, one word, one action could tip the balance. And Mariah knew that the confrontation ahead would not just decide her personal battle, but redefine the dynamics of the entire street. The question now lingered in every mind in the room. Who would emerge victorious? The answer was coming, and when it did, it would be nothing short of explosive. The tension on Willow Creek Lane had reached a breaking point. Every minor infraction, every passive-aggressive note, every petty violation had culminated in a single moment, a confrontation that no one, least of all Karen, could have anticipated. Mariah Thompson stood on her driveway that morning, calm in appearance, but electric with purpose beneath the surface, as a line of HOA inspectors, board members, and curious neighbors gathered like spectators at a spectacle they did not yet fully understand. Karen was at the forefront, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and poised, radiating the confidence of someone certain she had orchestrated the game, and that victory was already hers. But Mariah had not arrived unprepared. Every notice, every letter, every citation had been meticulously documented. Each infraction Karen cited had counter evidence, procedural oversights, and photographic proof that revealed manipulation rather than violation. Marcus, her husband, had ensured that the tow companies had been quietly aligned with their strategy. Any attempt at overreach would instantly backfire. What the HOA perceived as control, the Thompsons had turned into vulnerability, ready to expose every overstep, every abuse, every miscalculation. The confrontation began subtly. Karen pointed to Maria's mailbox, still a minor point of contention, insisting that its placement violated HOA guidelines by a few inches. She read aloud the clause she had cherry-picked, her voice precise, condescending, as though the weight of the board's authority alone could crush resistance. Maria's calm, measured response was simple. She produced photographs taken months before, showing the mailbox exactly as it had always been, accompanied by correspondence from the HOA confirming prior approval. The room went quiet for a moment, the first crack appearing in Karen's facade. Emboldened, Mariah continued, detailing a series of incidents where Karen had knowingly misrepresented rules to intimidate, listing every fabricated violation, every untimely notice, every attempt to manipulate neighbors into questioning her legitimacy. With each revelation, Karen's posture stiffened, her eyes darting nervously as the room absorbed the evidence. The neighbors, once hesitant and silent, began murmuring, some openly expressing surprise at the depth of manipulation that had gone unnoticed for so long. The meticulously maintained illusion of Karen's control was unraveling in real time, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. But Karen was not ready to concede. She shifted tactics, accusing Mariah of ignoring multiple warnings, of resisting authority, of creating tension in the neighborhood. She attempted to call on the HOA's procedural authority, insisting that fines be imposed immediately, that towing be executed, and that Mariah's record be marked with non-compliance. It was a calculated attempt to intimidate, to regain the narrative, but this was precisely where Marcus's quiet influence came into play. The tow trucks she relied upon, the very instruments of her threats, were now controlled by Marcus's directive. The parking lot outside the Community Association office became a theater in itself. Any attempt to tow Mariah's vehicle was met with professionals calmly refusing to comply, citing legal protections and procedural missteps. Karen's plan, which had depended on fear and intimidation, collapsed in an instant. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Karen's voice rose, her normally composed tone cracking with frustration as she attempted to maintain authority. She demanded immediate action, but each demand was met with counter evidence, procedural objections, and precise legal documentation provided by Mariah. Every bluff Karen played was exposed, every threat diffused. The crowd watched, riveted, as the power dynamic shifted visibly. The woman who had once ruled the neighborhood through fear was now on the defensive, struggling to salvage credibility in front of witnesses who were finally seeing the truth. Then came the public humiliation. A moment so calculated and precise it sent shivers through the room. Maria revealed recordings, captured emails, and official HOA procedural manuals showing that Karen had repeatedly violated her own rules. These were not minor oversights. They were documented manipulations, carefully orchestrated to create the illusion of authority. She presented a timeline of harassment, each incident meticulously cataloged, demonstrating not only pattern but intent. The board members, many of whom had once nodded along to Karen's dictates, now looked uneasy. Murmurs spread through the room. Whispers of disbelief, of shock, of relief rippled among neighbors. Karen's expression darkened, her composure finally giving way to the strain of being publicly exposed. The climax escalated further when Maria, with the calm authority that had been building beneath weeks of harassment, revealed the final piece of her strategy. Legal counsel, retained quietly weeks before, was present and ready. Every procedural overreach by the HOA was now actionable. Every threat of fines, towing, or punitive action could now be challenged with evidence of abuse and misconduct. It was a turning of the tables so absolute that Karen's attempts to regain control were no longer plausible. The room seemed to hold its breath, watching the dismantling of authority that had once seemed untouchable. Karen, sensing the tide had shifted irreversibly, attempted one last desperate maneuver. A challenge to Maria's credibility, a questioning of motive, a suggestion that the accusations were exaggerated or retaliatory. Maria responded with poise, her voice steady, her evidence irrefutable. Witnesses, neighbors who had initially been silent, began recounting their own experiences, confirming the patterns of harassment, the arbitrary enforcement of rules, and the manipulation orchestrated by Karen. It was a cascade, a crescendo of truth that left no room for denial. Karen's authority crumbled under the weight of exposure. Her public image shattered in front of those she had sought to control. The emotional intensity of the moment was palpable. Maria felt a mix of vindication, relief, and a deep, simmering satisfaction. She had endured weeks of relentless harassment, navigated a labyrinth of petty rules and threats, and faced public scrutiny, all without yielding. Her resolve, patience, and meticulous preparation had brought her to a moment where authority itself was questioned, and justice, long delayed, was finally apparent. Karen, once so confident and untouchable, now faced not only the scrutiny of neighbors but the real possibility of legal consequences, all laid bare by the homeowner she had underestimated. Even as the confrontation reached its apex, the narrative tension remained. Karen's attempts to defend herself grew more frantic, her composure failing as neighbors whispered among themselves, as board members looked at the evidence with widening eyes, as the magnitude of the miscalculations became undeniable. Every lie, every manipulation, every petty act of intimidation was documented and exposed. The humiliation was complete, the reversal total. Where once Karen wielded power through fear, now Maria commanded respect through preparation, evidence, and unwavering poise. And yet Maria understood the importance of restraint. She did not gloat. She did not taunt. Her victory was decisive, but she allowed the room to absorb it fully, letting the weight of facts and evidence speak louder than any words could. Karen, now visibly defeated, retreated from the confrontation, aware that her position was untenable. The board, having witnessed the unraveling of authority firsthand, could no longer maintain the pretense of neutrality without acknowledging the abuses that had been revealed. The neighborhood itself felt the shift. Where once tension and fear had governed interactions, a new sense of clarity emerged. The residents, who had been caught between compliance and suspicion, now understood the true nature of the conflict. The rules once wielded arbitrarily were seen in a new light. Authority once assumed was no longer absolute. And Maria, standing at the center of it all, exuded a quiet strength that transformed the perception of power in Willow Creek Lane. As the confrontation drew to a close, Maria looked out over the assembled crowd. Neighbors who had once whispered doubts and anxieties, board members who had hesitated to act, and Karen, whose defeat was complete yet unspoken, and understood that the battle had been won, though the ripples would continue. Every threat, every fine, every harassment notice had been met with strategy, patience, and resolve. The peak confrontation had not only restored her control over her property and her name, but had also exposed the vulnerabilities of those who relied on intimidation and manipulation to enforce authority. And in that moment, as she collected her evidence, acknowledged the subtle nods of respect from neighbors, and watched Karen retreat in silence, Mariah knew the story was far from over. The resolution was on the horizon, the consequences were unfolding, and the neighborhood would never view power, authority, or the HOA in the same way again. Because on Willow Creek Lane, the balance of control had shifted, and the storm that had been building for weeks had finally broken. Revealing not just the fragility of authority built on fear, but the quiet, unyielding power of preparation, strategy, and resolve. The question now lingered: how would the HOA respond? How would the neighborhood adjust? And what lasting impact would this battle leave behind? The answers would come, but only in the aftermath of the storm that Mariah had so expertly navigated, turning harassment into triumph, threats into leverage, and fear into undeniable respect. The storm that had swept through Willow Creek Lane had finally passed, leaving the neighborhood changed in ways no one could have predicted. For weeks, the streets had been a stage for harassment, intimidation, and bureaucratic overreach. Now, in the aftermath, clarity and justice began to settle over the community like sunlight piercing through clouds. Mariah Thompson, who had endured the relentless pressure, the petty fines, the fabricated violations, and the invasive inspections, finally felt the weight lift from her shoulders. But more than relief, there was a profound sense of transformation, both for her and for the neighborhood she had fought to protect. The first sign of change was immediate. The HOA board, shaken by the public exposure of Karen's manipulation and procedural overreach, convened an emergency meeting. What had once been an intimidating body, capable of issuing fines and threats at will, now faced accountability. Board members who had blindly followed Karen's lead were forced to confront their complicity. Some offered apologies, tentative and awkward, acknowledging that they had failed to see the pattern of harassment unfolding in their midst. Others quietly resigned, unwilling to participate in an organization whose credibility had been irreparably damaged. The neighborhood watched closely, some with relief, some with lingering skepticism, as the board's authority was recalibrated under the watchful eyes of residents who had once been intimidated into silence. Karen, the architect of the conflict, became a cautionary figure in the community. Her reputation, meticulously cultivated over years of feigned authority, lay in ruins. Neighbors who had once whispered in her favor now spoke openly about the manipulations, the threats, and the unnecessary stress she had imposed on residents. Her attempts to regain control were met with polite resistance at best, open skepticism at worst. Karen's confidence, which had seemed unshakable, had been undone not by confrontation alone, but by meticulous preparation, evidence, and quiet strategy. The very tools she had underestimated when she targeted Mariah. The irony was palpable. The woman who had relied on fear as her instrument of control had been undone by its own weakness. Mariah's own life, however, was not defined solely by the defeat of Karen or the recalibration of the HOA. The resolution went far deeper. The letters, fines, and threats that had once weighed on her became artifacts of a story of resilience. She had documented everything meticulously and had transformed harassment into leverage, demonstrating a mastery of patience, strategy, and careful observation. The process had been exhausting, emotionally and mentally, but it had also reinforced lessons that could not be undone. Preparation was power, evidence was truth, and courage was most effective when paired with calm precision. Her victory was not just personal, it was instructive, showing everyone in the community, and perhaps beyond, that even the most entrenched systems of control could be challenged, exposed, and corrected. In the weeks following the confrontation, the neighborhood experienced a subtle but profound shift. Residents, emboldened by what they had witnessed, began questioning outdated rules, proposing revisions, and seeking transparency in the HOA's operations. Meetings became forums for constructive discussion rather than fear-driven compliance. Homeowners began documenting their own interactions with the board, creating a culture of accountability where previously there had been submission. The neighborhood, once a theater of intimidation, began to feel like a community again, a place where appearances still mattered, but where fairness, respect, and clarity now held equal weight. Mariah herself became an unlikely symbol within the community. Not out of desire, but out of respect, neighbors sought her counsel, asking how she had navigated what had seemed an impossible situation. She spoke of preparation, patience, documentation, and strategy, emphasizing that no one should allow fear to dictate their actions. She reminded residents that authority was not infallible, and that standing firm with calm resolve often achieved results that confrontation alone could not. Her advice, shared quietly but widely, began to shape interactions across Willow Creek Lane, creating a neighborhood culture less susceptible to manipulation and more anchored in fairness. The personal consequences for Maria were equally meaningful. She had endured weeks of stress, sleepless nights, and emotional strain, but the experience also reinforced her resilience and her confidence in her ability to protect her family and her home. Her children, who had been largely unaware of the intensity of the conflict, now witnessed firsthand the power of perseverance, careful planning, and moral fortitude. Marcus, who had supported her quietly throughout, noted her strength with pride, understanding that the victory was as much emotional and strategic as it was practical. Together, they had navigated a crisis that could have consumed the neighborhood, and in doing so, they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united. The HOA itself underwent structural changes. Policies were rewritten to prevent the type of abuse Karen had engineered. Procedures for issuing fines, posting violations, and enforcing rules became more transparent, and oversight mechanisms were established to ensure accountability. Residents were allowed greater input into decisions, and a committee was formed to review complaints impartially. Where fear and intimidation had once governed behavior, fairness, clarity, and evidence became the guiding principles. The neighborhood, once fragmented by whispers, notes, and unseen pressures, found a renewed sense of cohesion, where trust slowly began to replace suspicion. Karen, facing the full consequences of her actions, eventually moved away from Willow Creek Lane. The abruptness of her departure, whispered among neighbors, became almost symbolic. The self-proclaimed enforcer had been defeated, not by aggression, but by strategic patience and preparation. Her absence marked the final chapter of the conflict, allowing the community to breathe, rebuild, and redefine itself without the looming shadow of intimidation. Where once she had dictated the terms of engagement, the rules, and even social dynamics, her departure allowed for a restoration of balance, fairness, and civility. Maria's victory carried lessons that extended beyond Willow Creek Lane. In the broader context of community dynamics, HOA disputes, and neighbor conflicts, her experience illustrated the power of preparation, observation, and strategy in confronting entrenched authority. It demonstrated that patience, documentation, and calm decisiveness could neutralize intimidation, turn threats into leverage, and expose manipulation without resorting to retaliation or aggression. The story was a testament to the strength that comes from knowing one's rights, understanding the rules, and executing a plan with precision and composure. For neighbors, the transformation was palpable. Those who had been hesitant or intimidated now approached meetings with confidence, armed with questions, evidence, and expectations of transparency. The petty power plays that had once defined interactions became less effective. Authority now had to be earned, justified, and accountable. Willow Creek Lane, once dominated by subtle fear, had become a neighborhood where fairness and respect set the tone. The lessons of the conflict extended beyond the immediate parties involved, shaping community norms and expectations for years to come. Mariah herself reflected often on the journey. She understood that the conflict had been unavoidable in many ways. Karen's ambition, the HOA's unchecked authority, and the culture of compliance had created a perfect storm. Yet, she also recognized that every challenge had been an opportunity to test her resolve, sharpen her strategic thinking, and reinforce her principles. In victory, she found not just relief, but clarity about the kind of leader, neighbor, and guardian she wanted to be. Not one driven by fear or intimidation, but by fairness, preparation, and quiet authority. Marcus remained her anchor throughout, reminding her that power was most effective when applied thoughtfully, strategically, and with restraint. Together, they ensured that the neighborhood's newfound clarity was maintained, not through dominance, but through guidance, support, and transparency. Their approach demonstrated that influence, when used responsibly, could create lasting positive change in contrast to Karen's misuse of authority, which had ultimately isolated and undone her. The ripple effects of the conflict continued to shape the community. New residents arriving on Willow Creek Lane were introduced to a neighborhood culture that valued accountability, fairness, and evidence-based governance. The story of Mariah's triumph was shared quietly but persistently, a cautionary tale for those tempted to wield power without transparency or integrity. And while the streets remained orderly, the manicured lawns unchanged, there was a new undercurrent, an awareness that authority could be challenged, that manipulation could be exposed, and that courage, combined with preparation, could restore balance even in the most intimidating situations. Looking back, Mariah realized that the greatest victory was not in the fines avoided or the letters dismissed, but in the restoration of her dignity, the protection of her family, and the establishment of fairness as the cornerstone of her community. Every act of harassment, every attempt at control, had been neutralized not through confrontation alone, but through meticulous planning, calm strategy, and unwavering resolve. Karen's threats, once terrifying, had become the very instruments of her downfall, while the HOA's authority, once absolute, had been recalibrated to reflect fairness, transparency, and accountability. The story of Willow Creek Lane, once a tale of intimidation and harassment, had transformed into a testament to resilience, preparation, and justice. Mariah's journey offered a blueprint for anyone facing unfair authority or neighborhood conflict. Document meticulously, respond strategically, maintain composure, and never underestimate the power of evidence and quiet resolve. Her experience illustrated that even in environments dominated by fear and manipulation, it is possible to reclaim control, restore balance, and create lasting positive change. And as the sun set over the street for the first time in weeks, without the tension of letters, inspections, and threats, Mariah stood on her porch, surveying the quiet, orderly lawns, the neighbors chatting casually, and the world she had fought to protect. The victory was complete, but its lessons remained. Enduring authority should be earned, fairness must be demanded, and courage, combined with strategy, could overcome even the most entrenched forces of intimidation. In the end, Willow Creek Lane was more than a neighborhood. It was a story of power, patience, and triumph. It was proof that even in the face of relentless harassment, injustice, and manipulation, those who prepare, document, and act with calm determination can shift the balance, expose wrongdoing, and secure justice. And while the community would continue to grow, rules would continue to be enforced, and new challenges would arise, the memory of this battle would serve as a reminder. No system is unassailable, no intimidation absolute, and no authority above scrutiny. So, as the neighborhood settled into its newfound equilibrium, the question remained. Not for Maria, who had already answered it with action, but for every viewer listening to her story. How would you respond if someone tried to erase your name, threaten your home, and intimidate your life? Would you yield to fear, or would you, like Mariah, prepare, observe, and reclaim control with strategy, patience, and unwavering resolve? The lessons are clear, the victory undeniable, and the story now lives as both warning and inspiration for every street, every HOA, and every homeowner who believes in standing their ground.